The gunfire came 4 minutes before the bell, and Briar Holt was the only person in room 214 who recognized the sound for what it was. It arrived as 3 flat cracks, muffled by 2 floors and a stretch of decorative garden wall, easy enough to mistake for something else if a person had never had a reason to learn the difference. Petra Vondrel, 2 seats over, didn't even look up from her slate. Instructor Feyn kept talking, mid-sentence, about the Concord's third ratification crisis and the trade language that had nearly collapsed it, her silver-gray hands tracing a projected treaty clause in the air above her desk. 15 students went on taking notes, or not taking notes, or passing a folded paper boat back and forth along the third row, in the particular unbothered hum of the last class period on a Tessera afternoon, because on Tessera, a neutral world built for exactly this kind of quiet diplomatic business, a campus of glass halls and terraced gardens where the worst thing that ever happened was a visiting minister's motorcade running late. A sound like that had no obvious category to fall into. Briar's pencil stopped moving. She counted under her breath, the way Nan had taught her before Briar was old enough to understand why counting mattered. 1. Spacing between reports roughly even, which meant a person firing with intent rather than panic. 2. The flat, unechoing crack of a suppressed energy discharge rather than the sharper bark of a training weapon from the dueling yard 3 buildings over, which was the only place on this campus anyone was supposed to be firing anything at all. She was already turning in her seat toward the window before the intercom cut in, a full 4 seconds later, with the calm, over-rehearsed tone the Corvane Preparatory Institute reserved for fire drills and apparently for this. Attention, this is a Tier 1 security advisory. All instructors, secure your classrooms and initiate shelter protocol immediately. This is not a drill. The room went from unbothered to loud in under 2 seconds, the particular loud of 30 people each discovering fear at the same moment and needing somewhere to put it. Instructor Feyn's projection died mid-clause. She crossed to the door in 4 strides, palmed the lock plate, and the heavy composite door of room 214 sealed with a pneumatic hiss that Briar had heard exactly twice before in 2 years at this school, both times for drills that had ended with everyone filing back to their seats laughing about it within 10 minutes. Nobody was laughing now. Down, away from the windows under the desks, quiet, Feyn said, her voice pitched to cut through the noise without raising in volume, a trick Briar recognized from someone who had commanded people before and hadn't forgotten how. Students scrambled, some of them fast and disciplined about it, the ones from military families who drilled this 100 times somewhere else, some of them clumsy with a terror none of their sheltered lives had prepared them for. Isolde Kharon in the front row didn't move at all for 3 full seconds, her pale silver eyes fixed on the sealed door as if it might explain itself to her personally, before Doskin Ilvanth, skinny, quiet, the kind of boy who fixed the school's projector system on his own time because nobody else could be bothered to learn how, half dragged her down behind the science bench they shared. Briar didn't get under a desk. She was still turned toward the window, one knee up on her chair, watching the garden courtyard 3 stories down where a maintenance cart sat abandoned at an angle that told her the person driving it hadn't parked so much as bylaid. 2 figures in gray service coveralls were moving along the courtyard's east colonnade in a formation that had nothing to do with maintenance work, spaced, covering each other's angles, moving in short controlled bursts between cover the way people moved when they expected to be shot at rather than when they expected to fix a light fixture. Holt, Feyn's voice sharper now close behind her, down now. They're not drill staff, Briar said, without turning around. Coveralls are wrong, institute maintenance badges pin on the left shoulder, theirs are on the right. And nobody clears a garden path in that formation to change a filter. For a beat the classroom held very still, 30 faces turning toward the strange human transfer student who talked about badge placement in a moment everyone else was spending on being afraid, and Briar felt the old, familiar weight of being looked at like that, like something slightly wrong for the room, tolerated rather than understood. Settle onto her shoulders the way it had settled every week since she'd arrived at Corvane 14 months ago from a homestead most of these students couldn't have found on a star chart even after she pointed to it. She let it settle. She'd carried worse. "Under the desk," Feyn said again, quieter this time, not unkind, the tone of an adult trying to manage one more variable in a situation that had already stopped making sense. "Please." Briar came down off the chair and crouched by the window ledge instead of the desk row, low enough to be out of sightlines from the courtyard, close enough to keep watching. It wasn't defiance. It was math. Nan Ilse Holt had died 2 winters ago on the porch of a homestead called 9 Mile Stand, on a world the Concord's own settlement charter classified hazard tier 6, one of 11 recognized Deathworlds still carrying active human population, a rating that meant the wildlife alone killed 40 registered colonists a year before anyone got around to counting the weather. And in 61 years on that world, she had never once told her granddaughter that hiding was a strategy. Hiding was a delay, sometimes a necessary one, never a plan. The next 4 minutes did not feel like 4 minutes. The intercom cycled the same advisory twice more, the calm, automated voice fraying almost imperceptibly on its 3rd pass in a way that told Briar someone in the security office had started manually re-triggering it, which told her the automated lockdown sequence hadn't finished doing whatever it was supposed to do. A dull, concussive thump rattled the window glass from somewhere below and to the left, not gunfire, something heavier, a breaching charge or a door forced hard enough to complain about it, and 3 separate students started crying at once, quietly, the kind of crying people did when they were trying very hard not to be heard doing it. Isolde Kharon wasn't crying. She had gone the particular gray-white color of Kessin's skin under real fear, her hands locked around Doskin's sleeve hard enough that her knuckles had lost their color entirely, and she kept saying, under her breath, in the clipped formal Kessin she reverted to when her Concord standard slipped, a single phrase Briar's 2 years of language credits were just barely good enough to translate. "They came for me. They came for me. This is for me." Nobody else in the room heard it clearly enough to understand it. Briar did, because she was crouched 4 feet away with her ear angled deliberately toward the front row instead of the window, and she filed it without comment, the way Nan had taught her to file information that mattered before she decided yet what to do with it. "Instructor Feyn." Briar kept her voice low level, aimed only at the teacher, who had taken up a position by the door with her back against the composite panel, and a look on her face that Briar recognized, the specific stillness of someone doing arithmetic they didn't like the answer to. "How long does full campus lockdown take from advisory to security response, on paper?" 6 minutes, Feyn said. "Security response is stationed at the east gate and the admin block. We're the far side of the science wing from both. And the doors seal from inside, not out. Nobody's coming to unlock us even after security clears the halls. We'd be waiting on someone to manually walk this corridor and check every room." "That's correct procedure, Holt. It keeps hostiles from forcing entry. It also means if they get a breaching charge to this door before security gets here, there's nowhere left to go once it's open. 30 of us in one sealed room with one exit is the easiest kill box on this floor to build, and they've already got a doorway open somewhere below us. That thump wasn't a warning shot. That was them getting through something." Briar kept her eyes on the courtyard, not on Feyn, because she'd learned a long time ago that people believed things faster when you said them like a fact instead of an argument. "How many of you are trained for an actual breach, not a drill?" Feyn didn't answer that. She didn't have to. Corvane Preparatory Institute was a diplomatic school on a neutral world that hadn't seen an armed incident on campus in the 40 years of its charter. Its instructors were scholars and administrators, and in Feyn's case, a retired logistics officer who had spent her military career moving cargo manifests, and had not personally fired a weapon at another sentient being in over a decade. The realization crossed her face plainly enough that Briar didn't need the Ithran-grade emotional literacy. She didn't have to read it. Another thump closer. Then a third, closer still, with a wet crackle underneath it that Briar's ear placed immediately as an energy weapon eating through a lock mechanism rather than a door being kicked. Isolde made a small, strangled sound. Briar looked at her, really looked, past the fear-white skin and the death grip on Doskin's sleeve, to the thing underneath it, which was a 16-year-old girl who had just told herself, out loud, in a language she'd assumed no one else in the room understood, that a team of armed people had come to this specific building for her specifically, and had not yet said a single word of that to anyone with the power to act on it. Fear did that. Briar had seen it do worse. On a world where fear that froze a person, instead of moving them, tended to end their story permanently rather than just badly. She made her decision the way Nan had taught her to make decisions, fast, once, without revisiting it afterward to second-guess the version of herself, who'd made it under worse information than she had now. Isolde. Briar crossed the 3 feet of floor between them and crouched at her eye level, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry past the science bench. They're here for you, aren't they? Isolde's eyes came up wide, and something in her face cracked open, not surprise that Briar knew, but the particular relief of a secret finally being spoken by someone else's mouth instead of having to force it out of her own. How? You said it yourself, 30 seconds ago, in Kessin formal. I caught it. Briar didn't soften the next part, because softening it wouldn't make it less true, and there wasn't time to be gentle about arithmetic. This room has 1 door, 30 people in it, and whoever's downstairs already knows which floor to be on. If we stay sealed in here and wait for them to reach us, we're not shelter. We're a room they walk into on their own schedule with everyone already accounted for and nowhere to run. I've watched something like that happen before, on a smaller scale, and I am not doing it again. Do what then? Feyn's voice from the door tighter now, an adult listening to a 16-year-old lay out a tactical assessment and hating how much of it tracked. Briar stood. She crossed to the window, checked the courtyard again. The 2 figures in mismatched coveralls had moved out of sight toward the science wing's side entrance, exactly the route that led to this floor. And then she crossed to the door itself, past Feyn, and put her palm flat against the composite panel the way she'd put her palm against a homestead door 100 times before checking a lock, feeling for the give in a mechanism instead of trusting the readout. You keep everyone else exactly where they are, quiet, low, away from sightlines, Briar said, and you keep that door sealed the second I'm through it. If I stay in here, this room is a box with 1 way in that they control the timing on. If I'm out there, it's a corridor with more than 1 direction, and I know this building's back stairwell better than whoever's running that team does, because I've been late to 3rd period sneaking through it for a year. She glanced back once. At 30 faces staring at her like she'd started speaking a language none of them recognized. At Isolde's white-knuckled hands and Doskin's frozen stillness and Feyn's expression somewhere between authority and disbelief. I'm not waiting for the door to be my choice. Holt, you are a student, Feyn said, low and urgent. You are 16 years old, you do not. I'm from Kharon's reach. Briar said it plainly, without the weight most people put on it when they found out, because to her it had never been a badge, only a fact, the way a person's eye color was a fact. Class 6 settlement. My grandmother buried 3 neighbors killed by wildlife before I turned 10 and taught me to read a threat before it finished announcing itself, because on the reach the ones who waited to be sure didn't get a second guess. I am not telling you I can win a fight against a professional team. I am telling you that whatever's coming through that door in the next 90 seconds is coming whether we're ready or not, and I would rather meet it somewhere I chose than somewhere they did. Feyn held her gaze for 1 full second longer than the moment had room for, and then, The particular decision of someone who had spent a career trusting subordinates' field judgment over her own comfort, stepped back from the door. "Go," she said, "fast, and Holt." The older woman's hand caught her sleeve just for a moment. "Come back through this door. I mean that as an order, not a courtesy." Briar didn't promise anything she wasn't sure she could keep. She palmed the lock release, felt the pneumatic seal disengage under her hand with a hiss that sounded in that moment exactly like the sound Nan's storm door used to make in the half-second before something on the reach, decided the porch light meant an invitation, and she stepped through into the corridor, into whatever was already coming up the stairs to meet her, and let the door seal itself behind her before anyone inside the room had time to change her mind for her. The classroom was surrounded by assassins. Briar Holt had just opened the door. The East Science corridor ran in a straight 50-meter line from the stairwell to room 214's alcove, lined with equipment lockers and a bank of tall windows overlooking the garden courtyard, and Briar cleared the first 10 meters of it at a flattened jog before she heard the footsteps coming up from below 2 sets. Unhurried, the confident, unbothered pace of professionals who had cleared the ground floor without resistance and had no reason yet to expect any on this one. She didn't run at them. Running told a trained team exactly where a target was and exactly how fast it was moving. She went sideways instead, into the equipment alcove outside the chemistry storeroom, and pulled the narrow service door most students didn't know existed shut to a 2-inch gap, and watched. The first figure came around the stairwell, landing in gray coveralls with the mismatched badge Briar had clocked from the window. A compact suppressed weapon carried low and ready, moving with the particular economy of someone who'd done this enough times that adrenaline no longer showed on the outside. The second followed 4 paces back, covering the rear angle, taller, broader through the shoulders, with a data slate in one hand that he consulted without breaking stride, checking a floor plan, Briar guessed, or a head count or both. "Second floor clear on the east side," the taller one said, low into a throat mic. "No resistance. Moving to target position, corridor 214. Room 214. Her room, Isolde's room." Briar's pulse didn't spike the way it might have a year ago, back before 14 months at Corvane had worn some of the Reach's old instincts smoother without ever quite sanding them away. It settled, instead, into the particular cold clarity Nan used to call the still water, the place a person's mind went when there was exactly one useful thing to think about and everything else had to wait. 2 operatives, 1 data slate with what was probably the building schematic. A confirmed verbal target designation, matching the room she just walked out of. She let them pass the alcove. Then she came out low and fast behind the rear operative, the taller one, the one with the slate, and drove her shoulder into the back of his knee hard enough to buckle it, using the momentum of his own forward stride against him the way Nan had drilled into her 1,000 times on the porch of 9 Mile Stand with a padded staff, and a patience Briar hadn't understood the value of until years after she'd stopped resenting the bruises. He went down hard, the slate skittering across the floor tile, and Briar was already moving past him before he'd finished falling, because the lead operative had heard the impact and was turning, weapon coming up, and a fight that lasted longer than the first 3 seconds was a fight she was more likely to lose than win. She got inside his weapon's arc before he could level it, caught his wrist with both hands and twisted the joint the way you twisted a trap spring to set it without losing a finger to the release, and the suppressed weapon clattered free and skidded toward the windows. He was bigger than her, faster in the shoulders, and he recovered from the disarm in under a second with the flat, efficient fury of a man who did not enjoy being embarrassed by someone half his size. But Nan hadn't raised Briar to win fights on strength, because the Reach didn't care how strong a 14-year-old girl was against a hazard Tier 6 predator twice her mass. She'd raised her to win them on angles, on knowing exactly where a body was weakest and being unwilling to hesitate about using that knowledge, and Briar drove the heel of her palm up under his jaw with everything her legs could put behind it, and felt him go loose and drop. The rear operative, the one with the slate, was already back on his feet, favoring the leg she'd buckled, weapon coming up in a shaking two-handed grip that told her the knee injury had rattled his composure more than the weapon's steadiness suggested. Briar didn't wait to find out how good his aim was one-legged. She caught the fire suppression lever mounted beside the chemistry storeroom door, standard on every science corridor in the building, installed for exactly the kind of accident that never happened on a diplomatic campus and existed anyway, because regulations didn't care about probability, and hauled it down with both hands. The corridor filled with a shrieking alarm and a wall of chemical fire-suppressant fog in under 2 seconds, dense enough to swallow the window's daylight whole, and Briar was already moving through it low and sideways before the operative's first blind shot cracked past where she'd been standing. She hit him from an angle he couldn't track through the fog, took the weapon with a wrench that cost her a bruised thumb she wouldn't feel until much later, and put him down beside his partner with a strike aimed carefully enough not to kill either one of them, because a body Nan had taught her one more thing about a fight, which was that the living ones could still answer questions, and a corpse never could. The fog was already thinning by the time Briar dragged both operatives, one at a time, into the equipment alcove and out of the main corridor sightline, working fast, breathing hard, cataloging what she had. 2 weapons, 1 data slate with a cracked but functional screen, and roughly 90 seconds before whoever else was on this team noticed 2 of their people had stopped checking in. She took the slate first. The schematic on it wasn't the public campus map posted in every hallway. It was a security overlay, detailed down to camera blind spots and door lock schedules, the kind of document that came from someone with inside access rather than a floor plan pulled from public records. And layered over it, in a secondary window Briar had to swipe through 2 authentication prompts to reach, because the taller operative's thumbprint was still warm enough on the reader to fool it, was a target file. Isolde Vessa Kethran. Age 16. Priority, terminate prior to 1700 Concord Standard. Confirm visual before engagement. Contract specifies no secondary casualties if avoidable. Client requires death to appear unrelated to treaty proceedings. 1700 Concord Standard. Briar checked the slate's clock display without meaning to feel the drop in her stomach that followed. 4:07 p.m. 53 minutes. She crouched beside the rear operative, the one with the buckled knee, groggy but starting to focus his eyes again, and pressed the heel of her hand, not gently, against the joint she'd already damaged, enough pressure to make the point without doing further harm. "Who's the client?" she said. He said nothing, which she'd expected, and then said something in a language her translator earpiece rendered half a beat late as a slur she didn't bother resenting, which she'd also expected. She increased the pressure fractionally. "You have a contract that specifies the death looks unrelated to a treaty signing," she said. "That means somebody wants this to read as random violence instead of politics, which means somebody's worried it'll be traced back to them if it doesn't. I don't need you to tell me who. I need you to tell me how many more of your people are in this building, and where, because that's the only piece of information standing between you keeping that knee and losing it entirely." "You're a child," he managed, thick-tongued, disbelieving despite the evidence directly in front of him. "I'm from the Reach," Briar said, and didn't elaborate, because she'd found over 14 months at Corvane that the explanation rarely helped and the demonstration always did. "How many more?" He gave her a number 6, including the field leader, split into 2 teams covering the science wing and the admin corridor, where the treaty delegation security liaison was stationed, and a call sign for the leader, Vask Oron, spoken with the particular flat respect of a subordinate who was more afraid of his own chain of command than of the girl currently kneeling on his ruined leg. Briar filed it, all of it, the still water in her mind sorting the pieces into something usable, and then she zip-tied both operatives' wrists with cables stripped from the nearest equipment locker, took their weapons and the slate, and moved. 51 minutes to the deadline. 5 operatives still active minimum. One classroom of 30 people who thought their only job right now was staying quiet under a desk, and one alien girl inside it who had just found out, in the worst possible way, that the fear she'd been carrying alone all afternoon had a name and a timer attached to it. Briar went back for room 214, because whatever came next, it wasn't going to happen with the people she was responsible for still boxed into a room with one exit, and no idea the clock had just started running. Instructor Feyn had the door open before Briar's knuckles finished the second knock, which told her the older woman had been standing close enough to the seal the entire time to hear it coming, and the look on her face when she took in Briar's condition, fire-suppressant residue in her hair, a shallow scrape along one forearm, 2 confiscated weapons slung across her back, was not the look of someone deciding whether to believe a story. It was the look of someone recalculating, fast, everything she'd assumed about the 16-year-old standing in front of her. 2 down, zip-tied in the science alcove, Briar said, already moving past her into the room, keeping her voice pitched to carry to the whole class without shouting. 5 more active minimum split between this wing and the admin corridor. They have a schematic with our lock schedules on it, which means somebody fed them building access they shouldn't have had, and they're not here for random violence. She looked at Isolde, who had gone very still again, differently still than the fear-frozen stillness from before, the stillness of someone bracing to hear a thing she already suspected confirmed out loud. They're here for you. Contract says before 5 o'clock, made to look unconnected to the treaty signing. Does that mean anything to you? The room had gone silent in a different register now, not panic, but the particular silence of 30 people realizing the danger had a shape and a reason instead of being random, which was somehow both worse and more useful at once. Isolde's jaw worked for a moment before the words came. My mother signs the mineral rights accord with the conquered delegation at 5, she said, low, and then, faster, like something dammed up finally breaking loose. My uncle Doral has fought the accord since the drafting stage. He says it undercuts the consortium's exclusive claims, that mother's giving away 3 generations of Kharon leverage for a treaty that benefits Earth more than it benefits us. If I'm dead before the signing and it looks unconnected, a random assault, a tragedy, nothing anyone can trace, mother withdraws from the ceremony to manage the crisis. The accord lapses on its own filing deadline. Doral becomes regent in the interim by succession law, because I'm the only other Kharon heir withstanding, and he renegotiates the whole accord from a regent's authority instead of a governor-elect's. Her voice cracked on the last of it, not from fear this time, but from the particular fury of understanding your own family. He wouldn't. He's my father's brother. He held me when I was an infant. He wouldn't. People who wouldn't don't usually need 6 professionals and a timed contract, Briar said, not unkindly, because there wasn't room right now for anything gentler, and Isolde, to her credit, didn't flinch from it. We don't have 50 minutes to argue about whether it's true. We have 50 minutes to make sure it doesn't work. Doskin Ilvanth had come up beside Isolde at some point during the exchange, his usual quiet stillness replaced by something sharper, more focused, the particular energy of a person who'd spent his whole life being the one who fixed things nobody else understood, and had just found a problem exactly his size. The building's internal comm relay routes through the science wing server closet, he said, 2 doors down from here. If they've got our lock schedules from an inside feed, that feed's probably still live, which means I can find it and maybe cut it, or better, feed it something false. He looked at Briar, an equal now instead of a boy hiding behind a lab bench. If you can hold that corridor for 10 minutes, I can blind whatever's watching us. Feyn had crossed to the door again, some old instinct in her posture reasserting itself, spine straightening in a way that made her look, for the first time all afternoon, like the officer she'd once been rather than the history instructor she'd become. I'm not letting 2 students walk into that corridor without an adult. You're the only adult in this room who can keep 28 other students calm and quiet for the next 10 minutes, Briar said. That's not a smaller job. It's a different one. She held Feyn's gaze steady, the same steadiness Nan used to level at a reach storm before deciding whether it was worth riding out or worth running from. I need this room held together. I need Doskin's hands on that server closet. And I need you to trust that I've done more of this than any of us wish I had to say out loud. Feyn didn't answer right away. Then she reached to her own belt, unclipped the small emergency channel transponder every instructor carried, and pressed it into Briar's palm. Direct line to the security office, she said. If it stops broadcasting, I'll assume the worst and I will not wait quietly to have it confirmed. Do you understand me, Holt? Yes, ma'am. Then go, all 3 of you. And Isolde, Feyn's hand found the girl's shoulder, brief and firm. Whatever happens in the next 50 minutes, your uncle does not get to decide who you are by deciding whether you live. Remember that, whatever else you remember. The door sealed behind the 3 of them a moment later, and the corridor outside room 214, fog mostly cleared now. Alarm still shrieking somewhere down the hall belonged, for the next stretch of the afternoon, to a Deathworld girl, a scholarship boy with quick hands, and an heiress who had just decided, for the first time in her sheltered life, that she was done being only the reason other people fought. The server closet was smaller than Briar had expected, a cramped alcove between the chemistry storeroom and the emergency stairwell crammed with cooling units and cable trunking. And Doskin had the access panel off and his hands inside the housing before Briar had finished checking the corridor both directions for movement. Here, he didn't look up, fingers moving fast and sure over a tangle of fiber leads, the particular focus of a boy who had spent his whole life being unremarkable at everything the school valued and extraordinary at the one thing it didn't bother testing for. There's a relay patched into the building's own security backbone that shouldn't be here. Somebody spliced an outbound feed into the lock schedule server sometime in the last few days, routing a mirror of it somewhere off campus. That's how they had our door timings. Can you find where it's going? Not fast enough to matter, but I can kill it, and I can feed the mirror something wrong instead of nothing. If I cut it clean, whoever's watching knows immediately that we've found the leak and adjusts. If I feed it a false lock schedule instead, they keep trusting bad information a little longer. Doskin's jaw tightened with concentration. Give me 90 seconds. Isolde stood at the alcove's mouth, watching the corridor the way Briar had taught her in the 10 seconds it had taken to walk here, weight forward, eyes moving, not frozen, and something in the set of her shoulders had changed since room 214. Fear was still there. Briar could see it in the faint tremor she hadn't fully mastered, but it had stopped being the only thing occupying her. I know the override codes for the admin corridor's secure doors, Isolde said, quiet, like she was testing whether the offer would be taken seriously. Family clearance. My mother's delegation is sheltering there with the treaty staff. If there's a second team converging on that corridor the way your prisoner said, they'll need more warning than the general lockdown gives them. Briar looked at her, really looked, the way she'd looked at her back in the classroom, and saw not the frightened heiress who needed dragging under a desk but someone starting, in real time, to understand that being the reason a fight existed didn't mean she had no say in how it ended. Feyn's transponder patches to the security office. If you can raise them directly with your clearance behind it, that carries more weight coming from you than from a scholarship transfer they've never had a reason to trust. Isolde's hands were shaking as she took the transponder Briar held out, but she didn't hesitate over the channel. This is Isolde Kharon, Kharon Clearance 719, hostile contact confirmed East Science Wing, minimum 6 armed operatives. Target is myself. Second team likely converging on the admin corridor treaty delegation. I need security response redirected to protect my mother's staff, not the wing I'm already clear of. Her formal kessing slipped through under the strain, the same reflexive cadence Briar had caught back in the classroom, but her voice didn't break. Confirm receipt. A burst of static, then a clipped acknowledgement from someone on the other end, and Isolde exhaled like she'd been holding that breath since the first gunshot. Done, Doskin said, straightening from the housing, the access panel clicking back into place under his palm. Feeds live with false data now. It'll show the science wing locks as still sealed and inactive for the next 20 minutes, minimum, before anyone watching realizes the numbers don't match what their own people are seeing on the ground. That buys us time they don't know they've lost, Briar said. Good work. Both of you. She checked the corridor again, both directions, and the flat, unhurried professionalism of the two operatives she'd already dealt with sat uneasily against the number the injured one had given her, 6 total, meaning 4 more still moving somewhere in this building, and one of them wearing the callsign Vask Oron with the kind of respect a subordinate only gave someone dangerous enough to be worth fearing more than the job itself. They didn't get the 20 minutes. The stairwell door at the corridor's far end opened without warning, no footsteps to announce it, which told Briar before she'd even turned that whoever was coming through it had heard something. The fire alarm cutting off abruptly on some override maybe, or a check-in from the two operatives she'd zip-tied that had gone unanswered too long, and had stopped bothering to move quietly. 2 more figures in the same mismatched coveralls, weapons already up, already scanning. Briar shoved Isolde and Doskin back into the server alcove's narrow gap before either shot could find a line on them, felt the doorframe splinter behind her ear as a suppressed round chewed through composite paneling 6 inches from where her head had been a half-second earlier, and returned fire with the weapon she'd taken off the first operative, not aimed to kill, because a corridor this narrow made a wild shot as dangerous to Isolde as to anyone else, but aimed low, at legs and cover. Buying distance instead of blood. Fall back to the stairwell behind us, she said, low and fast to Doskin. Second exit east end, past the chemistry storeroom. Go now, I'll cover. I'm not leaving you, Isolde started. You're not leaving. You're moving to somewhere I don't have to worry about you while I do this. Briar didn't look away from the corridor, tracking the two operatives' cover positions behind an equipment locker and a fire door propped half open. I need you both alive and I need my hands free. That's not you being useless. That's you being the only 2 people in this building I trust to run the right direction without me having to watch you do it. Something in that landed. Isolde grabbed Doskin's sleeve and went, fast and low, and Briar held the corridor's mouth alone for the 4 seconds it took them to clear it, trading suppressed fire with 2 professionals who had. She registered with the same cold clarity Nan's still water always brought her. Started to sound rattled, voices raised now. Coordination fraying. The particular noise of a team whose easy job had stopped being easy sometime in the last 6 minutes, and hadn't figured out yet how badly. A voice cut through the exchange, clipped, accented, carrying the unmistakable weight of command even through a throat mic's compression. Report. Report your positions now. Silence from the 2 pinned behind the equipment locker, because reporting meant admitting a 15-year-old girl with a scavenged weapon had them pinned in their own ambush. I'm reporting for them, Briar called back, into the gap between shots, because sometimes the most useful thing a person could do with a moment like this was make the other side's leader as uncertain as possible. 2 of your people are zip-tied in the science alcove. These 2 are pinned and not moving well. Your lock schedule feeds compromised and feeding you bad data, and your 50-minute window just got a lot smaller because the delegation's already been warned. A long pause. Then the same voice, quieter now, closer, close enough that Briar understood, with a drop in her stomach that the still water couldn't entirely smooth away, that its owner was already in the corridor and had been listening from somewhere she hadn't accounted for. You're the Deathworld transfer. It wasn't a question, and it carried none of the dismissive curiosity Briar had gotten used to hearing in that phrase from classmates who meant nothing worse by it than thoughtless condescension. This voice weighed the words like a professional weighing, a variable he hadn't planned for. Vask Oron, Briar said, because she'd learned his name from a frightened subordinate and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Your contract said no secondary casualties if avoidable, which tells me your client cares more about deniability than body count. That's useful information. It means you're not going to burn this whole building down to finish the job. You need it to look clean, which means every minute I keep this messy costs you more than it costs me. You've cost me 4 operatives and a compromised feed in under 10 minutes, Oren said, and there was something almost like respect buried under the flat professional menace of it, the particular respect one predator sometimes extended another before deciding whether to treat it as a threat worth escalating for. That is more than any single security response on this campus has managed in the Charter's 40-year history. I would very much like to know where a 16-year-old learned to do that. Class 6 settlement, Briar said. You wouldn't have heard of it. Not many people who haven't lived there bother to remember the names. I know Deathworld classifications better than most, Oren said, and something shifted in his tone, recalibrating in real time the way Briar had watched a dozen classmates' expressions recalibrate over 14 months. Except this recalibration carried teeth behind it instead of curiosity. I've simply never had reason to fight one who was still a child. I find I have questions about that. I intend to have my answers before this contract closes at 5 o'clock, one way or another. The 2 pinned operatives used the exchange to break for the stairwell, dragging their wounded pride with them, and Briar let them go rather than risk overextending into open ground for a fight she didn't need to finish here. She fell back instead, toward the east stairwell where Isolde and Doskin waited, checking Feyn's transponder. Still broadcasting, still steady, a small mercy in a corridor that had stopped offering many, and did not let herself think too long about how much confidence had been sitting underneath Vask Oron's voice, or about the 41 minutes still left on Isolde's clock. They regrouped in the stairwell landing, Doskin already working a second access panel he'd found bolted beside the fire door, patching into a camera feed that gave them, for the first time all afternoon, actual eyes on more of the building than the 50 meters of corridor Briar had personally cleared. There, Doskin tapped the feed, and a grainy overhead view resolved of the admin corridor 2 floors down, where 4 figures in security uniform, real security, Briar registered with a flicker of relief she didn't have time to fully feel, had taken up position outside a set of reinforced doors, weapons drawn, clearly responding to Isolde's warning. Your call got through. They're covering the delegation. That's one team accounted for, Briar said. Which means whatever's left of Oron's people is either regrouping to try the admin corridor anyway, against security that's actually braced for them now, or they come back for the actual target instead of wasting more people on a hardened position, Isolde finished, quiet, steady in a way that told Briar the girl had done more growing up in the last 12 minutes than most people managed in a year. Me. That's still the fastest way to collapse the signing before 5 o'clock. Security at the admin corridor doesn't matter if I'm dead before Mother ever gets there. Nobody argued with the logic because it was sound, and sound logic didn't get kinder just because it was frightening. Then we don't let them find you standing still, Briar said. Doskin, can you get eyes on the rest of this floor from here? Partial. Enough to see movement, not enough to be sure of numbers. He scrolled the feed, and a shape resolved near the science wing's central atrium, the greenhouse annex glass-walled, built into the school's original architecture as a botany classroom and left mostly unused for the last decade except by the horticulture club, its access running along an elevated walkway that connected to exactly one other corridor. 2, maybe 3 signatures, moving toward the greenhouse walkway. That's a dead end, unless they're planning to use it as a choke point. Or unless somebody wants to force whoever's chasing them into a space with exactly one way in and one way out, Briar said, and felt the shape of an idea start to form, cold and clear. The same shape Nan used to talk her through on the porch of 9 Mile Stand when a reach predator had circled the homestead 3 times in one night and stopped being content to wait them out. A greenhouse is glass, irrigation lines, chemical fertilizer stores, and one door. That's not a dead end. That's a trap, if the person setting it knows the ground better than the person walking into it. You want to lead them there, Isolde said, and it wasn't quite a question. I want to stop reacting to wherever Oren decides to put his people next, Briar said. I've been fighting this whole afternoon on his schedule, react to a corridor, react to an ambush, react to whoever comes through a door I didn't choose. That ends now. He wants me. Fine. I'll make sure he finds me somewhere I picked instead of somewhere he did. She looked at both of them and didn't soften what came next, because there wasn't room left in the afternoon for softening things that needed to be said plainly. I need 30 minutes rigged into that greenhouse before he gets there, and I need both of you somewhere safe enough that I'm not fighting with one hand thinking about you the whole time. Doskin, can you get back to Feyn's room through the route we came, without crossing the atrium? Yes. Then take Isolde. Get her behind that sealed door and stay there until security clears the wing or Feyn's transponder tells you it's over. No, Isolde said it flatly, and there was nothing frightened left in the way she said it. You told Feyn you weren't waiting for the door to be your choice. I'm not going back to being the reason people fight while I hide behind a locked room and wait to hear how it ends. My mother built that accord on the idea that Kharon and Earth stopped treating each other like liabilities to be managed from a safe distance. I'm not going to prove Uncle Doral right about what kind of heir I am by doing exactly that in the one moment it actually matters. She held Briar's gaze, and something in it, not fearlessness, Briar could see the fear was still there, banked but present, had firmed into something closer to resolve. I know this building's mechanical systems better than either of you. I've spent every free period for 3 years in that greenhouse, because it was the one place at this school nobody expected a governor-elect's daughter to actually enjoy manual labor. Let me help you rig it instead of sending me somewhere to wait. Briar studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk against the plain fact that Isolde wasn't wrong about the greenhouse, and made the same kind of decision Nan had taught her to make fast, once, trusting the read she'd already done rather than second-guessing it under pressure. Then you're with me, she said. Doskin, keep eyes on that feed and get word to security the second you see an opening. The more of them converging on us with backup instead of us doing this alone, the better this ends. But if it goes wrong before they get here, I need you clear, because somebody has to be able to tell Feyn what happened if I can't. Doskin didn't argue that logic either, though it cost him something visible to accept it, and 39 minutes before Isolde Kharon's contract expired, a Deathworld girl and an heiress who had just decided her own life, was not a decision that belonged to anyone but her walk together toward a glass-walled greenhouse to build a trap out of irrigation pipe, chemical fertilizer, and the particular patience of 2 people who had both, in their own very different ways, spent their whole lives being underestimated by the room around them. The greenhouse annex ran 40 meters along the science wing's south face, a single long structure of curved glass panels and load-bearing struts built 2 decades before Briar was born, connected to the rest of the building by one elevated walkway, and Isolde showed her within the first 90 seconds. One narrow service stared down to the irrigation cistern below that almost nobody at Corvane remembered existed. That's the only other way in or out, Isolde said, already moving down the center aisle between raised beds of transplanted Kharon flowering vines and a stubborn, thriving row of Terran tomato plants some previous horticulture student had smuggled in as an experiment years ago, and nobody had bothered to remove. If we control both, we control the room. What do you need? Height, choke points, and something that buys me a half-second of confusion the first time he comes through that door. Briar was already moving, cataloging the space the way Nan had taught her to catalog a homestead perimeter before a storm. Not what a room looked like, but what a room could be made to do. The overhead irrigation lines ran the full length of the structure, on a pressure system fed from the cistern below. The horticulture club's chemical stores, locked behind a flimsy cabinet, nobody had ever thought needed better security, because nobody had ever imagined a professional killer showing up to raid a greenhouse, held concentrated fertilizer compounds that produced, mixed the right way with the irrigation system's own water pressure. A fine caustic mist that wouldn't kill a person but would absolutely blind them for several critical seconds. The raised beds themselves, waist-high and solid-built, made a maze of a room a stranger would expect to be open ground. The walkway's the only approach with sightlines, Isolde said, pointing. Anyone coming from the science wing has to cross its single file, exposed, before they reach the door. If you're waiting inside with the beds as cover, they lose their spacing the moment they come through. Professionals fight in formation. Take the formation away and you're not fighting a team anymore. You're fighting one person at a time who doesn't know where the others are. Briar looked at her for a beat, something that wasn't quite surprise settling into place. You've thought about this before today. I've thought about a lot of things Uncle Doral would be appalled to know his niece thinks about, Isolde said, and there was a dry, brittle humor underneath it that hadn't been there an hour ago. Governor-elect's daughters are supposed to learn treaty law and court etiquette. I used to sneak my father's old tactics manuals out of the archive instead, before he died, because I liked understanding things nobody expected me to need to understand. I never thought I'd need any of it for this. Neither did I the first time, Briar said, and didn't elaborate further, because Nan's memory didn't need company right now, not with 36 minutes left on the clock and a fight still to build. Help me with the cabinet. And find something heavy enough to jam that service stair door behind us once we're set. I don't want anyone coming up from the cistern side while we're watching the walkway. They worked fast, in the particular efficient near silence of two people who had each, separately, learned that talking through every step of a plan wasted time better spent executing it. Briar rigged the irrigation line's pressure valve to a trip-wire strung ankle height across the walkway's threshold, feeding the fertilizer cabinet's contents into the line's reservoir in a measured dose. Nan would have approved of enough to blind, not enough to do lasting harm, because Nan's other lesson about a fight had always been that the goal was to end it, not to make it worse than it needed to be. Isolde found a length of chain in the horticulture shed and looped it through the service stairs door handle and a support strut, tight enough to buy real time against anyone trying to force it. Between the raised beds, Briar strung more cable, not to trip a person outright, low and taut at shin height in a pattern only someone who already knew where it ran could navigate cleanly, turning the room's open floor into a maze that would cost an unfamiliar attacker precious seconds of balance and attention every single step. If this works, Isolde said, quiet, checking the last of the cable's tension with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 10 minutes, you're going to have to fight him in here anyway. All of this just slows him down. It doesn't do the actual work. It buys the work better odds, Briar said. That's most of what a fight actually is, underneath everything people romanticize about it. Not one big moment of being braver or stronger than the other person. 100 small decisions, made faster and clearer than they can make theirs, until the gap between what they expected and what's actually happening gets wide enough that it beats them before you do. She checked Feyn's transponder again, still broadcasting, still steady, and then checked the greenhouse's single-wall clock, an old analog piece some long-departed instructor had mounted decades ago and nobody had bothered to digitize. 28 minutes to 5 o'clock. Get behind the far bed low and stay there no matter what you hear. If this goes the way I'm hoping, you won't need to do anything but watch. If it doesn't, I run for the service stair and I don't look back for you," Isolde finished, steady, the words costing her something visible to say and saying them anyway. "I understand the plan, Briar. I'm not going to be the reason it fails by refusing to follow it." Briar allowed herself exactly one breath's worth of something that wasn't calculation. A flash of Nan on the porch of 9 Mile Stand, 61 years of reach weather carved into her face, saying almost exactly that same sentence to a much younger Briar on a night 3 neighbors' worth of grief was still fresh enough to bleed. And then let it go, because the still water didn't have room for grief right now, only for the next 28 minutes. They didn't have to wait that long. The walkway's trip wire caught at 11 minutes past 4:30. A soft mechanical click swallowed almost entirely by the greenhouse's ambient hum of irrigation pumps, and the distant, muffled wail of the fire alarm still cycling somewhere in the main building. And Briar was already moving into position behind the third raised bed before the first figure's silhouette resolved against the walkway's glass. It wasn't Vask Oran. It was one of his remaining people, moving cautious and slow, weapon up, clearly aware by now that this contract had stopped being the clean, quiet job it was supposed to be. He crossed the threshold, and the pressure valve released on schedule, and the overhead irrigation line misted the doorway with a fine caustic spray that had nothing to do with watering plants. He choked, staggered, one hand clawing at his eyes, and Briar was on him before he found his footing again, a controlled strike that put him down without needing to finish what the mist had started. She dragged him clear of the doorway fast, and had barely gotten back to cover before the second one came through, more cautious this time, weapon sweeping, clearly warned by the first one's sudden silence that something in this room wasn't what it should be. He avoided the walkway's exact center, which meant he avoided the mist's worst concentration, but the cable maze between the beds caught his ankle 2 strides in and put him down hard onto the greenhouse's tiled floor, and by the time he'd recovered his balance, Briar had closed the distance and finished the fight before it properly started. 2 down, 2 of Oran's remaining people, which by Briar's count left at most 2 more active on this floor, Oran himself, and whoever hadn't yet shown their hand. The greenhouse went quiet again, ambient hum and distant alarm and nothing else, for long enough that Briar started to wonder whether the remaining 2 had decided the greenhouse wasn't worth the cost and pulled back to regroup somewhere she'd have to find them instead. Then Vask Oran came through the door alone, weapon lowered, hands visible, moving with the unhurried, deliberate confidence of someone who had already assessed the room and decided the traps in it were no longer worth avoiding because he had a different plan entirely. "Impressive," he said into the quiet, his gaze tracking the cable maze, the misted doorway, the 2 unconscious operatives Briar hadn't bothered to hide. He was tall, gray-skinned, some species Briar didn't immediately recognize, with the particular economy of movement that came from decades of professional violence rather than natural gift. "I've run this kind of contract 11 times in 19 years. I have never once had a target build me a trap instead of running from one." "You said you had questions," Briar said, staying low behind the raised bed, weapon steady, watching his hands rather than his face because hands told a person more about what was about to happen than an expression did. "Ask them from there. You're not getting closer." "My question isn't complicated." Oran didn't move closer, which told Briar he believed something about this conversation mattered more to him than closing the distance did. A Deathworld settlement raises its children to survive predators and weather. I've read the classification bulletins. Most directorate assessments treat that resilience as instinct, something bred into the species rather than taught, which is why nobody accounts for it properly in a threat profile. But instinct doesn't build a tripwire ambush out of a greenhouse's irrigation system in under 20 minutes. Instinct doesn't turn a stranger's own weapon against them without hesitation. That's training. Deliberate, deep, repeated training, the kind a person only gets from someone who loved them enough to make sure they survived something the trainer had already survived themselves. He tilted his head, something almost curious under the professional flatness. "Who taught you, girl?" "My grandmother," Briar said, because there was no reason left to withhold it, and because some part of her, the part that still carried Nan's porch and Nan's storm door and Nan's patient, relentless insistence that hiding was never a plan, wanted this man to hear the name attached to what he was about to lose to. Ilse Holt, 61 years on Kharon's reach before it killed her, and she never once let me believe the world owed me safety just because I hadn't earned danger yet. "She sounds like she would have made an excellent contractor," Oren said, and there was no mockery in it, only the flat professional respect of one predator assessing another's lineage. "It is, for what it is worth, a genuine waste that this ends the way it has to." "It doesn't have to end any particular way," Briar said. "Your contract specifies no secondary casualties if avoidable. You've already lost 4 operatives and a compromised feed to a target you weren't supposed to have to fight at all. Your client wanted this quiet and deniable, and it has been, from the very first shot, exactly the opposite of quiet. Whoever's paying you is going to have a very hard time explaining a building-wide security response, and 6 captured or unconscious contractors as an unrelated tragedy. The smart move, the only move that still protects your fee and your reputation both, is walking away from a contract that already failed the moment it stopped being clean." For a long moment, Oren didn't answer, and Briar let the silence sit, because Nan had taught her that too, that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do in a negotiation was fill a silence that was working in their favor. "You may even be right," Oren said finally. "Unfortunately, I have a professional reputation that survives on completing contracts, not on making sound tactical retreats partway through them. And I suspect, Deathworld girl, that you would not respect me any more for walking away than my own employer would." He shifted his weight, subtle, the first genuine tell Briar had gotten from him all conversation, and she was already moving before his hand finished closing around the weapon holstered at his hip. The fight that followed didn't happen the way the two before it had. Oren knew the cable maze was there before he crossed it, high-stepping through the gaps with a precision that told her he'd mapped it visually while they talked, and he came at her with a speed and control that made her earlier opponents look like the amateurs they, in comparison, clearly had been. Briar took a glancing hit across the ribs that stole her breath and put her back a full step, felt the raised bed's edge bite into her spine, and understood, with the same cold clarity that had carried her through every other decision that afternoon, that this was the fight the whole day had actually been building toward. Not the ambush, not the corridor, not even the greenhouse's careful traps, but this. One Deathworld girl against a professional who had killed for 19 years and had never yet lost. Isolde. Briar didn't look toward the raised bed where the girl was hidden, kept her eyes and her weapon on Oren instead, but pitched her voice to Carrie. "The mist reservoir. Second valve, the one I showed you." "Now." She heard, rather than saw, Isolde move, a scramble of fabric and footsteps, fast, low. Exactly the kind of decisive motion Briar hadn't been sure the sheltered heiress from that afternoon's first 4 minutes would still be capable of by the end of it. And Oren's attention flickered, just slightly, just long enough to register a second variable in a fight he'd been treating as a clean one-on-one. That flicker was enough. Briar drove low under his next strike, inside his reach where his longer arms couldn't find leverage, and used his own forward momentum the way Nan had taught her to use every larger opponent's momentum, redirecting rather than resisting, and put him down hard against the raised bed's corner, with a strike aimed precisely enough to end the fight without ending the man. Above them, the second irrigation valve released on Isolde's hand, and the mist caught what was left of Oren's balance and blinded whatever recovery he might have managed, and Briar finished it a half-second later with the same controlled economy she'd used on every operative before him, Enough force to put him down, not enough to make sure he never got back up, because a body couldn't answer for a client, and Briar wanted very badly, by that point in the afternoon, for someone to answer. Vask Oran went still on the greenhouse's tiled floor, breathing but unconscious, and for the first time since the gunfire had started, the room held nothing but the ordinary hum of irrigation pumps and the distant, finally slowing wail of an alarm someone in the security office had at last gotten authority to silence. Isolde came around the raised bed at a run and stopped short, staring down at Oran's still form with an expression Briar couldn't fully read, relief, and something rower underneath it, the particular vertigo of a 16-year-old confronting, in the flesh, the exact shape of the thing that had been sent to end her life. "Is it over?" Isolde's voice cracked on the question. "His part is." Briar checked Oran's pulse businesslike, then straightened, ribs aching where his strike had landed, and checked Feyn's transponder one more time, still broadcasting, still steady. But he wasn't the client. He was the contract. Whoever paid for this is still out there, and your uncle's name is the only one anyone said out loud today that actually explains why. 21 minutes to 5 o'clock. Somewhere below them, in an admin corridor now ringed by real security instead of a lockdown door, and a locked room's false safety, Governor-elect Vesa Kithrin's delegation was still counting down toward a signing ceremony that a man who had once held Isolde as an infant had tried, very quietly, very deniably, to make sure never happened. Briar didn't think the story was finished yet. She thought, checking the greenhouse's old analog clock one more time, that it had just reached the part where the truth had to catch up to the violence, and that part, unlike the last 20 minutes, wasn't a fight she could win with a cable trap and a fast pair of hands. Doskin met them at the walkway's threshold with two of the real security team behind him, and the next several minutes dissolved into the particular controlled chaos of professionals, finally arriving to clean up a scene 3 teenagers had already mostly handled themselves. Medics for the unconscious operatives. A senior officer taking Briar's account in short clipped exchanges, while another confirmed Oran's restraints twice over. Instructor Feyn arriving at a dead run down the walkway the second the all-clear reached room 214, her composure cracking open the instant she had visual confirmation that all 3 of them were upright and breathing. "You gave me an order to come back through that door," Briar said, before Feyn could get a word out, dry despite the ache settling into her ribs. "I did. Eventually." Feyn didn't dignify that with the retort it deserved, mostly because she'd already pulled Briar into a hard, brief embrace that had nothing composed about it at all, and released her just as fast, visibly embarrassed by her own reaction and not remotely sorry for it. The captured data slate went to security within the first 5 minutes, and it was the slate, not the interrogation, not Briar's account, not even Oran's own eventual, resigned statement, once he woke restrained and recalculated the odds of his contract's silence still protecting anyone. That did the real work of the next 20 minutes. Embedded 3 folders deep in the schematics metadata, half scrubbed but not scrubbed well enough by a man who had apparently trusted his employer's payment routing more than he should have, was a financial authorization trail, a shell account, a consortium subsidiary, and a signature authority that traced, through 2 more shells and a currency conversion designed to be untraceable by anyone without a compliance enforcer's patience for exactly this kind of paperwork, to Regent-designate Doral Kithrin. The senior security officer relayed it to the admin corridor with 11 minutes left on the clock, and Briar heard, second-hand and fragmentary over the next half hour as the pieces filtered back through Feyn and then through Isolde herself. What happened when Governor-elect Vesa Kithrin received the report in front of her own treaty delegation and her own brother-in-law, standing at her side in ceremonial dress, still composed, still confident, still apparently unaware that the building he'd paid to have his niece killed in had already caught him. Isolde told it plainly, hours later, sitting on an overturned crate in the greenhouse's service stair alcove, while security finished their sweep and the campus, floor by floor, cycled down from lockdown into the strange hollow quiet that always followed real danger once it had finally, definitively passed. "She didn't scream at him," Isolde said. "I think I expected her to." She just looked at him for a long moment in front of everyone and asked him to explain the authorization trail himself, out loud, before security removed him, because she said if it was a mistake, if there was some explanation none of us had considered, he owed her the dignity of saying so to her face instead of letting a data slate say it for him. Isolde's own hands were steady now, folded in her lap, the tremor from earlier finally gone. He didn't have an explanation. He just said her name once and let them take him. "Did she still sign?" Briar asked. "At 5:06, Isolde said, something fierce and tired and proud all tangled together in her voice. "Late, not derailed." She told the delegation the day's events only confirmed what the accord was supposed to prove in the first place. That treating each other as liabilities instead of partners was exactly the kind of thinking that let something like this happen, and that she wasn't going to let one man's fear of losing leverage undo 3 years of work just because he'd tried, and failed, to force the outcome with violence instead of argument. She looked at Briar, something unguarded in her expression that hadn't been there 14 months of shared classes had ever earned. "It held because you made sure I was alive to still be the reason it could." "It held because your mother didn't flinch when it mattered," Briar said. "I just made sure she got the chance to not flinch." Vask Oren spoke to security investigators twice over the following 2 days, and both times, by the account that eventually reached Briar through Feyn's careful second-hand summary, he answered every question about the consortium's payment routing, the client's identity, and the contract's original scope with the flat, unembellished cooperation of a professional who understood the leverage he'd lost and had decided, with the same cold arithmetic he'd brought into the greenhouse, that a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony was worth more to him now than a client's loyalty he no longer had any reason to protect. He asked on the second day whether he might be permitted to speak with Briar directly before his transfer off Tessera to await formal charges, and Briar, after some consideration, said yes, mostly because Nan had taught her that closing a door without ever looking through it once was its own kind of cowardice, even when the thing on the other side of it had tried to kill you. He looked smaller in the holding facility's gray intake uniform than he had in the greenhouse, though nothing about his posture had actually changed. The same economy of movement, the same flat professional stillness, just stripped now of the confidence that had made it read as menace instead of simple competence. "I wanted to tell you," he said without preamble, "that I have revised my professional assessment. I told you in the greenhouse that your grandmother would have made an excellent contractor. I no longer believe that was the more useful observation. I think instead that she taught you something most of my own trade never learns, which is that winning a fight and deserving to win it are not the same accomplishment, and that only one of those is worth building a life around." He inclined his head, something that in a different context might have been a bow. "I have killed for 19 years without once losing to someone I couldn't afford to respect afterward. I find that the losing troubles me a great deal less than I expected. I am not certain what to make of that." "You could make something of it," Briar said. "That's usually the point of finding out." "Perhaps." Oren studied her for a long moment. "For what it is worth, and I understand it may be worth very little, coming from where I am currently standing, I hope your world stops costing you people the way it apparently costs everyone who grows up on it. 61 years is not a long enough amount of time for anyone, Deathworld or otherwise, and I suspect you know that better than most people your age should." Briar didn't have a ready answer for that, and didn't try to force one, and after a moment the guards moved him on toward transfer processing, and that was the last conversation Briar Holt ever had with the man who had come to Corvane Preparatory Institute to kill her classmate and left instead, having lost a professional record 19 years in the making to a 16-year-old with a fire suppression lever, and her grandmother's patience. The academy reopened 3 days later, after a security review that Briar was informed of secondhand through Feyn rather than invited to personally, though the results of it reached her anyway, in the particular way that consequences of a thing a person had lived through tended to reach them regardless of whether anyone had thought to include them in the meeting. Corvane's shelter-in-place protocol, unchanged in the 40 years of the Charter, had never once accounted for the possibility that sealing a room might create the exact danger it was designed to prevent. The revised protocol, drafted in under a week by a board that had spent 3 days reviewing camera footage of exactly how badly the old one would have failed if a 16-year-old hadn't overridden it, added a new provision that Briar Reed, weeks later, pinned to the Science Wing's public notice board, with a formality that felt strange attached to something that had, in the moment, been nothing but instinct and arithmetic. Instructors and senior students with documented threat assessment training are authorized to make real-time tactical judgments during active security incidents, superseding standard lockdown procedure, where credible evidence indicates the sealed room protocol itself constitutes elevated risk. They called it, informally, before the formal policy language ever got attached, the Holt provision, and Briar found that she minded that a good deal less than she'd expected to. Instructor Feyn found her in the science corridor on the first day back, in front of the same window Briar had been crouched beside when the first shots came, and didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood beside her looking down at the courtyard where a maintenance cart, this time, actually belonged to maintenance. "I've served in logistics command for a career and a half," Feyn said finally. "I have moved cargo through 3 contested corridors and never once fired a weapon at another person in service of it. I told myself, for years, that made me lucky. I'm starting to think it mostly made me untested." She glanced sideways. "I owe you an apology I don't entirely know how to phrase. I told you to get under a desk." "You told me to keep myself safe," Briar said. "That's not the same thing as being wrong. You didn't know what I knew. Most people here don't, and most of the time that's fine. Most of the time, hiding actually is the right call, because most of the time the thing coming isn't the kind of thing that gets worse for waiting." She shrugged, feeling the last of the ache in her ribs, mostly faded now, a reminder rather than a wound. That day just wasn't most of the time. "No," Feyn agreed. "It wasn't." She was quiet a moment longer, and then, in the tone of someone finally asking a question she'd been circling since the moment the door sealed behind Briar in room 214, "Was it hard, deciding to open it?" Briar thought about that honestly, the way Nan had taught her to think about hard questions instead of reaching for the easy, comforting answer first. "No," she said. "The deciding wasn't hard at all. My grandmother made sure of that, a long time before I ever needed it to be easy. The part that was hard was everything after, trusting that the decision was actually right, once I'd already made it and there wasn't any way left to take it back." She looked out at the ordinary courtyard, ordinary students crossing it on their way to an ordinary afternoon class, and found that she didn't resent, the way she once might have, how little any of them understood about what a door could cost a person to open. "I think that's probably true of most decisions worth making. The deciding's usually the easy part. Living with it afterward is the actual work." Isolde found her at the end of that same week in the greenhouse, where Briar had taken to spending her free period since the incident, not because the space held anything sentimental for her, though it had started to, but because the tomato plant some long-gone student had smuggled in years ago needed tending, and nobody else on campus seemed inclined to bother. And there was something in the small, patient, unglamorous work of it that reminded her, in a way she hadn't expected a school greenhouse 11 light-years from the reach to manage, of Nan's porch. "My mother wants to meet you properly," Isolde said, settling onto the same overturned crate from the night of the incident, watching Briar work. "Not as a courtesy," she said, And I'm quoting her exactly because she made me memorize it before I promised to deliver it. That a governor who signs a treaty about partnership, without acknowledging the one partner who actually proved what partnership was supposed to mean, isn't a governor worth the accord she just put her name to. I don't need a ceremony, Briar said, not looking up from the tomato plant's stubborn new growth. I told her you'd say that. Isolde's mouth curved, something easier in it than Briar had ever seen from her before that afternoon in the science corridor. She said to tell you it isn't a ceremony. It's a standing invitation to the Kharon homeworld, open-ended, whenever you want it, no obligation attached, because she'd rather owe you a debt she never gets to properly repay than pretend the debt doesn't exist just because you're too stubborn to let her pay it. She paused. I told her that sounded exactly like something a Deathworld girl's grandmother would have taught her to refuse politely and mean it. She said that was precisely the point. Briar allowed herself, finally, something that wasn't quite a laugh, and didn't refuse it after all. Doskin's building something, Isolde added, after a moment, in the tone of someone changing the subject, because the last one had gotten close enough to something real that it needed a breath before continuing. A proper security auditing protocol for the whole campus, based on what he found in that server closet. He wants to name the compromised feed detection module after you too. I told him you'd hate that even more than the provision. I would. He's doing it anyway. Something about how the people who actually do the hard part rarely get asked whether they want their name attached to it, and he'd rather you be annoyed by it for the rest of your time here than let it go unrecognized just because you're allergic to being thanked properly. Isolde watched her for a moment, something quieter now underneath the teasing. For what it's worth, from someone who spent an entire year assuming the quiet scholarship transfer from a settlement she'd never bothered to look up on a star chart, didn't have much to offer this school beyond taking up a seat that could have gone to someone from a more useful world, I was wrong. I'd like to say that to you directly once, instead of just living differently around you and hoping you notice the difference. Briar set down the small trowel she'd been using and looked at her properly. This girl who had spent the worst afternoon of her life discovering, in real time, both how fragile her own safety actually was and how much steadier she could be than her fear had ever let her believe. You didn't need to be wrong about much, Briar said. You just needed a reason to find out what you actually were, underneath what everyone assumed for you. Most people don't get handed that reason as violently as you did. I'm sorry it took what it took. She considered the tomato plant, the greenhouse's quiet, ordinary hum, the courtyard beyond the glass where nothing was on fire and no one was counting down a contract's deadline. For what it's worth, my grandmother used to say the same thing about the Reach, that the world doesn't owe anyone an easy way to find out what they're made of, and the only real mercy in it is that most people eventually get the chance to find out, one way or another, whether they like the answer. Do you like yours? Isolde asked. The answer, I mean. What you're made of. Briar considered the question with the same unhurried honesty she'd given every other hard thing that week, turning it over the way Nan had taught her to turn over anything worth actually answering instead of just responding to. I like that I didn't have to find out alone, she said finally. That's the part I didn't expect, not the fighting. I always knew I could do that if it came to it. I didn't know, until that door was already open behind me, whether anyone here would trust it enough to fight beside me instead of just being grateful from a safe distance that I had. She looked at Isolde, at the greenhouse door standing open behind her onto an ordinary corridor full of ordinary noise, students moving past it without a second glance because the danger that had once filled it was, for now, entirely over. You did. That's worth more to me than a standing invitation to a homeworld I've never seen. Outside, the afternoon light came down gold and unhurried across the courtyard, the way it always had on Tessera, the way it had every day before the one everything changed and would keep doing every day after, indifferent to how close any of them had come to a very different ending. And Briar Holt, 16 years old, Class 6 Deathworld raised, granddaughter of a woman who'd never once let her believe safety was owed rather than earned. Went back to tending a stubborn row of tomato plants 11 light years from home, and found, for the first time in 14 months at Corvane Preparatory Institute, that the greenhouse finally felt like somewhere she actually belonged.